Hi everybody, this is your narrator Ali, and I hope you are ready to relax to our story today. Tonight, we travel far from deserts and caravans to misted pine ridges and sea-washed shores in ancient Japan, where the floating bridge of heaven once touched the earth and where a solitary monk meets the living mercy of Kwannon in the most unexpected way. Let the sound of your own breathing become the sea as we step quietly onto Ama no Hashidate. Chapter 1. The Floating Bridge of Heaven. Long before Saion Zenji was born, in an age that people call the Days of the Gods, there was said to be a bridge between heaven and earth. It was called Ama no Hashidate, the floating bridge of heaven. Through that shining path, the deities descended from the high plane of the sky into the land of fresh rice ears, carrying jeweled spears and great bows, feathered arrows and magic mirrors, robes that glimmered like starlight, and wonders beyond counting. When that direct way was finally withdrawn, and the gods no longer walked openly among human beings, the people still held the memory close. They gave the name Ama no Hashidate to a quiet strip of land that curved out into the blue sea like a bridge made of earth and dark pine trees. It became known as one of the three loveliest views in all Yamato. Sand and stone lying low upon the water, pine branches combed by sea wind, and the sky stretching down until it seemed almost possible to step into heaven. On clear days, travelers would pause and simply stand, listening to the waves stirring beneath the roots of the trees, imagining the footfalls of old gods upon an invisible road. Chapter 2. Saion Zenji, Seeker of Two Ways. In the city of Kyoto, not far from this sacred landscape, there lived a holy man named Saion Zenji. From his youth, he had followed the way of the gods, offering reverence at Shinto shrines, sensitive to the hidden spirit in rock and river. Later, he drank deeply from the teachings of the Buddha, studying sutras until their phrases burned like lamps in his memory. He knew the dangers of clinging to illusion and the promise of nirvana, that quiet shore beyond the restless tides of desire. Yet for him, wisdom was not only in scrolls. Long hours each day he sat in meditation, still as a stone lantern in a temple garden, while the wind moved through bamboo and the city's distant sounds fell away. Sometimes he felt himself standing at the edge between worlds, as if that old floating bridge might return at any moment. One year, on a pilgrimage to visit the holy places of the land, he came to Ama no Hashidate. The sky was a clear blue bowl, the sea below it a deeper shade of the same color. Pines bent over the water, casting long shadows that swayed like slow fans. Saion Zenji stood in silence, his traveling staff resting lightly in his hand. In his heart, he knew that this place was already chanting, that the rocks and trees were reciting their own sutras in a voice too subtle for untrained ears. He bowed to the view and gave thanks. Chapter 3. The Shrine at the Lone Pine. The foolish think that trees and stones are mute, Saion Zenji murmured to himself. But the wise know that all things praise the Tathagata in their own tongues. The beauty before him resonated so deeply that he felt he had reached the place his life had been walking toward. He decided not to return to the bustle of Kyoto. Instead, he climbed the mountain of Nariai, which faces the narrow sandbar of Ama no Hashidate, until he came to a solitary pine standing against the sky. There, where the wind from the sea met the quiet breath of the forest, he chose to dwell. He built a small shrine to Kwannon, the bodhisattva of compassion, whom people in that land call the Merciful Lady. Beside the shrine he fashioned a simple hut of wood and thatch, barely large enough for his sleeping mat, his scriptures, and an iron pot. Days found him seated before the image of Kwannon, chanting sutras from dawn until the last light slipped from the pine needles. His voice grew more resonant as his heart grew lighter. In those hours it seemed to him that he was not alone. The blue bellflowers bowed their delicate heads in rhythm with his chanting, white lilies breathed out fragrance like incense, and cicadas shrilled a piercing accompaniment from the trees. At times, a bird that rarely showed itself in daylight let out a solitary cry from the thicket, as if answering his prayer. Chapter 4. Blessings on the Valleys Below. Around the hermit's hut, a living halo formed. Dragonflies moved in bright circles, and butterflies drifted lazily through the sunbeams. The country folk believed these were the souls of the happy dead, drawn by the purity of Saion Zenji's devotion. Down in the river valleys, where farmers bent their backs over rice fields and barley patches, life seemed suddenly gentler. The sun did not scorch quite so fiercely. The winds that came were cool and steady. The rains, when they fell, were soft, as if poured from a caring hand. Old people whispered that it was the merit of the monk on Nariai that had calmed the seasons. From time to time, men and women climbed the steep paths to visit the lone pine. They knelt at the tiny shrine, laying rice or millet or beans in his wooden begging bowl, and asked Saion Zenji to pray for their sick children or their aging parents. He greeted each visitor with a quiet smile, his face weathered by the mountain air, and spoke simple words that somehow soothed deep anxieties. Sometimes he himself walked down into the villages, his patched robe shining faintly, people said, as if it held a secret radiance. He would sit beside those in pain, reciting verses of comfort, or stroke the heads of shy children who peered at him from behind their mother's sleeves. Soon people were telling one another that to see him was already a blessing. Chapter 5. The Winter of Deep Snow. Then came a winter that people would speak of for years after. The first sign was a wind, sharp and wild, dropping suddenly from the north. It howled along the ridges, rattling shutters and bending bamboo. Soon, huge flakes of snow began to fall, and they did not stop. For 9 days and nights, the sky poured whiteness upon the land. In the villages, families huddled close around hearths, counting their store of rice and pickles, burning extra firewood, yet feeling reasonably safe so long as their roofs did not crack. Up on the mountain, it was a different story. Around the lone pine, snow piled higher than a man's shoulders. Drifts swallowed the small path to the shrine. The little temple of Kwannon almost disappeared beneath the weight of the storm, and Saion Zenji's hut groaned under the burden on its roof. At first, he lived on the offerings that remained in his wooden bowl. When those were gone, he wrapped himself in his robe and turned inward, drawing close to his breath, sinking into meditation. For a time, contemplation itself gave him strength. It was as if he drank light and ate silence. But the body has its own laws. After some days, his limbs began to tremble, his head grew light, and even the clearest visions could not fully dispel the heavy clouds of hunger and cold. Chapter 6. The Dappled Hind. At last Saion Zenji understood that if he remained within, his body would fail and his voice would be silenced. He bowed before the unseen image of Kwannon and whispered an apology. "If I take thought for my own life," he said softly, "it is only that I may continue to chant the sutras for the sake of your people." With great effort, he pushed open the door of his hut. A hard, crystalline light flooded in. The storm had passed. The pine branches were laden with white. The long sandbar below lay like a pale brushstroke across the blue-gray sea. The air bit his face. As he stepped out, something on the ground caught his eye. There, not far from the threshold, lay a deer, a dappled hind, still and graceful even in death. She had succumbed to the cold, her gentle eyes closed as if in sleep. Saion Zenji knelt beside her and touched her soft flank. "Poor one," he murmured, "no more will you run light-footed among the hills or nibble at tender leaves." Compassion tugged at his heart. He remembered the precepts forbidding the taking of life or the eating of flesh. He thought of Kwannon, the merciful one, who hears the cries of all creatures. How could he break such a vow? Yet his hand shook, and a deep ache hollowed his belly. What good would his faith do the suffering villagers if he simply lay down beside the deer and died? As he hesitated, a voice seemed to rise from the quiet around him, not harsh, but firm and loving. It spoke straight to his heart. If he allowed himself to perish, it asked, who would comfort the poor in the valleys? Who would recite the sutras to ease their fears? Sometimes the voice seemed to say, one must bend a rule to protect the deeper spirit of the law. Chapter 7. Breaking the law to keep the law, Saion Zenji bowed his head. He did not know whether the voice was truly the Lady of Compassion or only the echo of thoughts he dared not claim as his own. But its reasoning pierced him. With trembling hands, he took a knife and cut from the side of the hind a piece of flesh no larger than his hand. He gathered fallen fir cones and dry twigs, coaxing a small fire to life beneath a flat stone. Smoke curled into the cold air. In his iron pot, he placed the meat with a little snow to melt into water. The smell of cooking rose surprisingly sweet and unfamiliar. He sat before the shrine, watching, torn between reluctance and an urgent need for life. When at last the meat was ready, he ate half, chewing slowly, aware of every fiber. Warmth spread through his limbs like a tide returning to an emptied shore. Strength stirred in his chest. Once more his voice could rise in praise. He turned back toward the shrine and began to chant. The notes spilled out clear and strong. Even the embers of the fire seemed to leap higher, as if eager to hear again the sacred verses that had been silent for too many days. The other half of the meat he left in the pot, intending to eat it later, or perhaps share it with any unexpected visitor snared by the snow. But reverence still tugged at him. I must not leave this gentle creature unhonored, he thought. When the ground softens, I will bury her properly. Chapter 8. The Vanishing Deer and the Golden Wound. With that intention, he stepped outside again, expecting to see the deer's body lying where he had left it. The snow around his hut glittered untouched. No trace of hoof or body or blood remained. The place was as smooth and white as a blank page. Saion Zenji stood still, the wind tugging at the edges of his robe. Had the storm buried the hind completely? Had some spirit carried it away? No sign showed. It is a strange thing, he said quietly, and though his mind could not resolve the puzzle, his heart felt a gentle, awe-filled tremor. Soon the villagers began to climb the mountain path, their faces anxious. They had been debating for days whether the holy man could possibly have survived such weather. At least, they told one another, we must know where to build his grave. When they reached the lone pine, they were amazed to hear the clear, familiar voice flowing from the hut. There sat Saion Zenji, very thin but alive, chanting as if the snowstorm had been no more than a passing shower. He told them simply that he had eaten of the flesh of a deer that lay dead on the snow and had found strength again. He spoke with some perplexity, wondering aloud at the deer's disappearance. I cut only a hand's breadth, he said, and half of that still rests in the iron pot. Curious, the villagers went to look. Inside the pot, they did not find cooked meat, nor any sign of blood or bone. Instead, there lay a small block of fragrant cedar wood, gilded on one side, just the size of the cut he had described. Their hearts beat faster. Something mysterious was unfolding. Chapter 9. The Healing of Kwannon's Image. Carrying the gilded piece with utmost care, the valley folk cleared a path through the snow to the shrine of Kwannon. They brushed snow from the roof and steps, opened the doors, and went inside. There, bathed in the pale light that filtered through cracks in the wood, stood the image of the Merciful Lady. Serene face, flowing robes, hands extended in countless gestures of protection and blessing. She shone among golden flowers carved at her feet and behind her halo. Yet on her right side, the people saw a narrow gash, as if a small section of the figure had been neatly removed. The exposed wood beneath the gold matched exactly the shape and grain of the cedar in their hands. With reverent trembling, they fitted the gilded block back into the wound. As soon as it touched the statue, the seam vanished, the gold surface smoothed over, whole and unmarred. A soft brilliance seemed to ripple across the image. The villagers gasped and fell with their foreheads to the floor. They understood then what had truly happened on the mountain. The dappled deer from which Saion Zenji had eaten was none other than Kwannon herself, taking gentle animal form to save her servant's life. Her own image bore the trace of the sacrifice. Now, with the people's faith and the hermit's story, that wound had been healed. Saion Zenji remained standing, tears on his face, his voice rising in pure song, unaware of anything but the presence of boundless compassion. Chapter 10. Hymn to the Thousand-Armed Lady. Night came quietly to Amano Hashidate. The sun set in clouds of rose and amber over the sea. Then the colors faded to deep blue. Villagers slipped away down the paths, leaving the hermit alone in the shrine. Through a broken tile in the roof, moonlight spilled onto the golden figure of Kwannon. It caught the lines of her face, gentle yet strong, and traced each of her many arms, symbol of her readiness to help all beings in countless ways. Before her, Saion Zenji stood, hands folded, still singing. His song was not a formal sutra this time, but a spontaneous hymn drawn from the depths of his experience. He praised her as strong and beautiful, yet tender beyond measure, willing to feed him with her own body so that he might continue to serve others. He marveled at the paradox of breaking a law in order to keep its heart alive, at the mystery of a bodhisattva who refused the final piece of nirvana in order to remain among suffering beings. He begged her to guard him against the illusions that creep even into a monk's mind, to free him from fear of snow and solitude, to help him loosen his grip on the world and cling instead to the divine song that echoed through all things. Tears ran freely down his cheeks, but his voice did not falter. In that small shrine, between the pine-crowned mountain and the shining sea, one man and one carved image stood together. Yet the space between them was filled with something vast and living, something that touched the valleys below, the floating bridge of heaven, and perhaps even the unseen realms beyond. Closing reflection, compassion in the snow. So ends the legend of Saion Zenji and Kwannon the Merciful. It is a story born from the meeting of human frailty and divine compassion, of law and the spirit that breathes within the law. The hermit on Nariai-san sought to leave the world, yet it was the world, the hungry poor in the valleys, the deer in the snow, the lady's wounded image, that called him back again and again to a deeper kind of service. In the moment when he believed he must choose between his own life and his vows, mercy met him in the form of a gentle animal, whispering that sometimes one must bend what is written in order to preserve what is eternal. The villagers, too, became part of the miracle. It was their faith and their careful hands that restored the golden wound and revealed the truth of what had happened. As you rest now, perhaps you can let this story settle like snow upon your own thoughts. Where in your life do rules feel rigid, yet the needs of living hearts call you to something softer, braver, more compassionate? Where have you, like Saion Zenji, been fed in ways you did not at first understand? Maybe the legend of Kwannon is reminding us that mercy often walks toward us in humble shapes, in a chance kindness, in a forgiven word, in the quiet strength that appears when we are certain we will break. This is your narrator, Ali, thanking you for sharing this peaceful night with a tale from the floating bridge of heaven, and wishing you a heart that hears the hidden songs of trees and waves, and finds, even in the coldest winters, the warm touch of 1,000-armed compassion. For more stories that can help you relax, don't forget to like and subscribe.